I was thinking of talking a little bit more about Heartseeker today, but I figured I've spent a lot of time talking about the item changes in this patch in the last few days, so we postponed that for a little bit later in the week. There's something that I kind of realized more today than before that I felt like talking about at this point. It's also item related, but it's a little bit different. Today we're going to talk about the tank meta in Smite. And by the tank meta, I don't mean one particular meta where we had a lot of tanks or we had a lot of tanky items going, but more how the meta in Smite is generally always to some degree focused on tank items and tank builds and tankier guards. Why would I come to this conclusion, or where's this coming from? Well, this basically started in today's Clash match where I was playing Camazotz and I was like, I could go tank or damage here or bruiser, it really depends on the team, and I realized, well, most of the team is going full damage, so I'm just going to go for a bruiser build. So far so good, just balances out the team comp a little bit more. And then what I noticed towards the end of the game is that I was basically battling the Kukulkan on my team for top damage. And I thought that was rather interesting. Now obviously to some degree this is obviously down to player skill, performance in that individual game and opportunities to deal damage, so it's not like you just deal the same amount of damage and it's like that in all situations, but I thought it was rather interesting that even though I primarily went for defensive choices or bruiser choices, I was able to keep up in damage with somebody going for relatively high damage items or a full damage build. But this got me thinking a little bit more. Looking over to other games of similar nature, other MOBAs, you will typically not find tanks dealing all too much damage, and when somebody opts into a tankier or bruiser build, the damage output is also relatively low. It still is impactful and there are items, for example similar to Mystical Mail, that will help you deal more damage in some of those games, but usually you're not quite on the same level as somebody who builds a full tank build in Smite in regards to their damage output. And this is something that is intended by Smite. This is something that helps, for example, with lane pressure, with lane clearing as well, making the game more fast-paced in that regard and making everyone a bit more of a threat. And establishing this first before we talk about this further is important. I'm not complaining about the way it is, I'm just pointing out how it is in Smite and how it is in other games in comparison. If you look back at metas in the past, there were various metas where we had 3 frontliners, there were even more metas where we had 2 frontliners, and there were metas where almost the entire team was building tanky to some degree. I cannot remember a single meta where we consistently saw less than 2 frontliners. We had situations and strategies where only one tank was absolutely a possibility. For example, when ADCs are very strong, we put another ADC into solo lane, or when Bakasura was very strong, he would be put into solo lane, and those strategies worked for a while, but they never really seemed to define a meta in the long term. A lot of the metas were more revolving around warriors, around guardians, and around hunters. Hunters obviously have this role because they're countering tanks. Now, as things currently are, that has changed a little bit. We, for example, also see Baron Samedi in solo lane, but again, when we see him in solo lane, we see him with a defensive build. And that's very interesting because it kind of goes against another theory. For the longest time, people thought the main reason why we see so many tank metas and so many prioritizations for tanks in many team comps is because they just have those insanely high base values. They don't need to scale up much, they just get a lot of tanky items and maybe a little bit of pen and they will do their damage. But that just might not be the main reason. Because another thing to consider here is that we are seeing more and more defensive builds or builds that include at least one defensive item. And when it comes to assassins or to jungler specifically, we had more aggressive builds in early seasons, usually with maximum of one defense item usually being Magi's Blessing, and we see a lot more bruiser builds there, up to full tank builds on the tankier assassins such as Ratatoskr, Surcat or Thanatos. But then we also see more defensive items on mid laners, we see more Magi's Blessing there again. We also see more defensive items on ADCs, we sometimes see a specific counter item. This being more of a niche strategy once again, but I think it's worth pointing out here. We see Midgardien Mail being built to counter the opponent, or other single defense items that are fit towards the end of the build when you already have a lot of damage. Creating this balance within your build makes a lot of sense, because obviously you're gonna scale up your output more and more and more, but at some point you're just kind of reaching a lot of thresholds, and it may be worth being a little bit more tanky and being able to survive more, and that way have a lot more time to deal your damage. Not always, but there are situations where this works out. But again, it's down to more than just that. In order to see that a little bit better, I think it is best to compare very traditional defense and offense items. And the ones in question here are Breastplate of Valor and Jotun's Wrath. Both of these items have almost the same price, with 2,300 gold versus 2,350 gold. Both of these items provide you with mana in one way or another. In Jotun's Wrath case, it's 150 flat mana. In Breastplate of Valor's case, it's 300 mana and 10 MP5. Both of these items provide you with 20% cooldown reduction, and both of these items don't have an additional passive. So the key difference here is that Breastplate of Valor is a little bit cheaper, has double the mana, and has 10 MP5. The other stats on the item are, in Breastplate of Valor's case, plus 65 physical protection, whereas Jotun's Wrath gives you plus 40 physical power and 10 physical penetration. Now obviously, they kind of match up against each other. You can pretty much directly put the power and the penetration against the protection. It depends a bit on the situation, it depends on if the damage is coming from abilities or from basic attacks and how much they scale with, but overall it's a pretty decent picture here, in which in most situations Breastplate of Valor will come out on top. 40 physical power and 10 penetration are usually not enough to go through the 65 physical protection in a direct trade. So if two characters just had those items each, then the Breastplate of Valor user should win. But still, on top of that, Breastplate of Valor has more MP5, has more mana, and is also cheaper. And this is something that if you're playing Duel, you're absolutely familiar with. There are hardly any gods that can get away without building defense in Duel. Most players only even consider not going into defense if they're really ahead, really confident that they will outplay their opponent anyways, and they just want to play aggressive and take down structures quicker, or they have another specific plan, say for example countering out a Morrigan to not basically get countered themselves by building defense. And other items paint a similar picture here. With Jotun's Wrath and Breastplate of Valor we are comparing something that is very similar, whereas with Devourer's Gauntlet and Height of the Nemean Lion we can compare direct opposites, or one being the counter to the other. Height of the Nemean Lion is 2,200 gold, while Devourer's Gauntlet is 2,300 gold. Let's compare the fully stacked stats here first. Devourer's Gauntlet has 65 physical power versus Height of the Nemean Lion's 70 physical protection. Again, only really if you have very high scalings will the power be better here. Likewise, the Devourer's Gauntlet with its full stacks will have 24% lifesteal, whereas Height of the Nemean Lion has 25% basic attack damage reflect. So 1% in favor of Height of the Nemean Lion here. But again, on top of that, Height of the Nemean Lion is 100 gold cheaper, and it also comes with 200 mana and with 20 MP5. So essentially, Height of the Nemean wins in every single department here when we're looking at the full stats, even if only by a little bit in some. But at the same time, Height of the Nemean Lion starts fully stacked. You don't need to stack it first, whereas Devourer's Gauntlet needs those stacks in order to be fully effective. And those stacks are so impactful that many gods can't even build Devourer's Gauntlet, as it takes so long for the item to be completely online. Now realistically, we obviously can't cover all the possibilities here in terms of what we can compare in regards to items, but I think those are some very striking examples, and that's a picture that basically repeats across other fields such as attack speed, reduction and attack speed, and similar as well. So I believe a big part of the reason why Smite prefers tankiness so much over pure damage is not just in the gods, but also in the items. This is also strongly indicated through bruiser items often receiving additional stats and buffs, for example extra health and similar, in order to keep them viable versus the full tank builds with some damage items thrown in at the end. and also by the fact that you will hardly ever see any tankier characters, any supports, or any soul laners go into any damage items or penetration items like Titan's Bane at all. Last but not least, the fact that Executioner and Titan's Bane is considered a viable combination at the moment, even though they kind of counteract each other, really speaks volumes about the value of defense items. Again, this is not to complain about this, but rather just to give you a different perception of item choices. And with that, thank you guys for watching. I hope this was interesting and insightful. If you're new to the channel, feel free to click the sub button with the bell. It really helps me out. And other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth out.